Okay, good morning and thank you for joining today. My name is Jane Robbins and I'm a buyer's agent here in Brisbane. We like to stop and share some of the data and what's happening here in the Brisbane property market every sort of quarter, and it's a great time for me to stop and review some of the data coming out of the research companies. And I present it just quickly to some of the people who want to look at it, to past clients and hopefully future clients. So this quarter, we've got some really interesting data. I'll acknowledge the sources that I've collected it from: CoreLogic, SQM, the ABS, so Australian Bureau of Statistics, and some interesting articles have come out from the Property Council of Australia that we'll touch on as well. I'll be covering off what's been happening in the start of 2024 here in Brisbane, what we're seeing here on the ground as well. Then I want to talk about some trends that we're seeing in the capital city market around Australia. And is there something emerging there? How Brisbane is performing against other capital cities. And we're going to talk once again about the issue of supply and how that's actually impacting now the broader economy here in Australia, and units versus houses here in Brisbane. And then I'll get into some of the predictions that I'm thinking for the rest of the year. And then some Q&A if we've got time at the end. So I'll try to keep this sort of to 20 to 30 minutes. So the year to date, so we're 4 months in to 2024, and Brisbane has slowed. It's in its pace of gains. So the numbers that came out at the end of April showed that Brisbane had grown in April by 0.9% at the dwelling level. So that's houses and units combined. So we're still seeing growth here in Brisbane, but it has dropped just below 1%. And we're seeing that now be a stabilised number. So we've sort of seen the monthly rate for the last 4 months has been in and around that 1% here in Brisbane. So it's still growing, but not at the rapid rate that we saw over the last few years. February to April, so in the last quarter, we've seen 3.1%. And that's still actually a good number of growth, like a good amount of growth, given that we've seen since the start of COVID a 57% growth in the Brisbane market. So we're still growing, just not at the rapid rate that we've seen over the last few years. We still have seen a very competitive market in the townhouse and units. We've been purchasing these for a lot of investors and first home buyers. It was a very competitive market right through last year in 2023, and that's definitely remained into this year. We've got a great example that we bought in February for a client in a certain building, and within that building in the last 2 weeks, another one has sold. So over 2 months between those two sales, and we saw a 10% increase in just those 2 months in the same building. So we're definitely seeing that market very competitive in terms of number of buyers, but also the increase in price we're seeing is great. The other sort of mention that's caught our eye here in Brisbane is that we've seen a number of homes now sell in the 4 million range. So in the past few years, like it was sort of like, oh, that was a big sale and that sort of 4 million plus. Now we're seeing probably weekly sales, we feel, and that 4 million is becoming quite a regular sale in those inner suburbs for those bigger sort of showcase homes. And then again, we're seeing a lack of listings. Probably we're getting used to it as buyers agents. We're sort of becoming more familiar with how to sort of find those listings for our clients, but there is definitely still a lack of listings, but that's been an ongoing problem, and we'll talk about that soon as well in a bit more detail. So I wanted to talk about an emerging trend that I'm seeing when I start to look into some of the data. So in terms of capital cities, Sydney and Melbourne have always sort of tracked together, and then Brisbane's always lagged a little bit behind. But what I've noticed when I was doing some, like, looking into the data, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth are trending very much together. And that's not just at the moment, like in the last few months, but it's probably been since 2024. So CoreLogic has come out and sort of called them the mid-sized capital cities. And so they've probably benefited most. So if we look at the data, the annual change in dwelling value, you can see annually that Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth are in and around the same sort of growth rates, especially compared to, say, Sydney and Melbourne, as well as, I suppose, the smaller cities of Hobart, Darwin. They seem to be trending their growth annually at the same rate. And then that made me sort of say, well, you know, it's one thing to be annual and sort of tracking together, but then when I pulled up some CoreLogic data as well, which shows the growth since the start of COVID, it is, you know, 56, 58, 59%. The same trend is existing in this, we'll call it mid-sized capital cities. And they are still at their peak. So you can see here, you know, the growth in these cities since COVID's been, you know, nearly, you know, 250 to 300K, but they're still at their peak. So we've seen, I think that that's a really interesting observation around the trend. And will we see Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth continue to sort of trend together in the market? I think it's worth keeping an eye on, because I know, you know, a lot of the data and a lot of the commentary is always around Sydney and Melbourne, but yeah, it looks like the grouping there may have changed slightly. So how's Brisbane gone, I suppose, as a city? Well, Brisbane dwelling price overtook Melbourne in January. There was a lot of reporting around that at the time. And it's something that we had noticed quite early on, a couple of years ago in COVID, we noticed how close Brisbane was getting to Melbourne. So Brisbane dwelling price overtook Melbourne in January, and we've actually seen that separation and that trend grow. So at the moment, Brisbane is sitting at $827 for its median price, and then Melbourne is at $783. So that growth is now sitting at 5.6% above. So that's because we're seeing, if you see here in the month of April, Melbourne's actually just slightly under, not growing at all. It's actually gone down just 0.1%, where Brisbane is up 0.9. So, you know, there's been 1% difference just in April. So that is at the dwelling level. We need to sort of make aware on the individual level of house and units. We're still seeing that Brisbane is below on those individual levels. It's a combination of a higher number of units in Melbourne, a higher percentage of their total dwellings are units, where here in Brisbane it's still houses. So that's what's giving us the dwelling value being higher. However, still on those individual levels of house and units, Melbourne is slightly higher. But I think we need to, it's getting very, very close now to Brisbane overtaking Melbourne's median house value. So it's currently sitting at 920, where Melbourne's at 941. So I think it's still, it's within 2%. So within this year, I'd expect that the house number will overtake Melbourne's. The other sort of couple of numbers in the data that's really interesting is that the unit growth here in Brisbane. So in the last year, it's gone up 17.4%, which is extremely high. And again, if you look at Adelaide and Perth, even in the units, the growth of like 14, 19% here versus what we're seeing in Sydney and Melbourne, it's a very different number that we're seeing in those three cities. And they seem to be trending together. So, yeah. The other data that has come out this month as well in the last week or so is that Domain have come out and said that they expect that the Brisbane house price will hit $1 million by the end of the year. That's a pretty big milestone for Brisbane. So they're expecting this 920 to hit $1 million. We can see over here Canberra's pretty close to that now too, but yeah, so watch this space. I think I have mentioned that towards the end in my predictions, if I agree with that or not. But yeah, so it could be great for Brisbane if that does happen. So now I wanted to talk about this great supply issue because it was mentioned a lot in the CoreLogic report that's come out this month. And I know we touched on this. I feel we have touched on this for years now here in Brisbane and even on a national level. But in reading the CoreLogic commentary this month, I think it has to be really brought to everyone's attention what they're saying too. So basically, CoreLogic saying that in the Australian economy, we over the last few years have had high interest rates, and it's still seeming that they could now stay higher for longer, given some inflation data that's just come out. We've had low consumer sentiment since COVID. We've had worsening housing affordability. So prices of houses have become more unaffordable for people, and that's been seen by the increase of cost of living too. So we've got all of these downward factors that we've had so much commentary and media come out and sort of say, oh, you know, the housing prices are expected to slow and decline. You know, we've heard of this, the mortgages are becoming the mortgage cliff when things come off of their fixed rates. We've heard a lot of negative commentary saying that, you know, housing prices should slow, should go down, but they haven't. And so they've come out now and said, despite all of these factors, it's the insufficient supply of listings relative to the demand that has outpowered all of those other things. So interest rates rising, lower consumer sentiment, all of these negative things. But the one factor that has, I suppose, trumped all of that is the supply of housing. And so it's pretty amazing when you sit back and think of that the economy is so impacted by the supply of housing here in Australia. So when you get down now into, you can go and see by each capital city what's happening with the supply of listings in the market. And listings, you can see nationally are at the low. So these graphs sort of start back in 2010 if you can't see, and then it just shows you houses are in the dark blue, units are in the light blue. You can just see here from about 2020 nationally, our listings went well below sort of where they had been trending prior. So listings have been down nationally, but then you know, you can look into all of the different cities. But again, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide have all dropped the most, and they're bringing that, like they've been impacted the most by listings, where Melbourne, where we haven't seen such great gains since COVID, their listings seem to have remained pretty much the same. So definitely your Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide markets are the ones where listings and supply have been pulling down the whole national average. But yeah, you've sort of seen there that this supply issue is at a city level very different, and that's impacting the prices. So that's the supply here in Brisbane has remained low and continues to, which then brings us to the unit market here in Brisbane. And I was reading a very interesting article just this week that's come out from the Property Council of Australia. So the Property Council of Australia is an independent research group who look into certain things, and they have come out and said there are some alarming numbers around the Brisbane unit market. So basically what they have said, they've looked into the approvals for units being built here in Brisbane. And so the government's plan for Southeast Queensland require a planning of 7,500 per year. And that has been from 2020 to 2025. They've sort of come out and said we need around 7,500 units just to be built each year to, you know, cope with the increase in growth in population for Southeast Queensland. And then when we look into what's actually been approved, we've had in between 2020 and 2023, we've had less than 2,000 apartments built. So, you know, in the last 4 years, we've been under the 7,500 by around 5,000 units, 5,500 units per year. And then in 2024, there is under construction, we have 3,000. So there's another, you know, shortfall there of 4,500. But in 2025, they're quite alarmed because there's only been a planning approval for 1,500. It's actually less than 1,500. So this issue around units is getting much, much worse. And it's just going to drive that supply issue and listing issue here in Brisbane. And I think the unit market, given that we've had 17.5% growth here in just the last year, if the supply is going to be getting worse, I think we've got a lot more growth in the unit market coming. So overall, when we sort of summarise those numbers, you know, the government came out and sort of said we need 45,000 units are required to cope with the population growth. And this is only in units, which is called attached approvals. So of the 45,000 that the government came out and said they were required to build, we've approximately got 12,500 in that same period that's actually being built. So there's a big difference there in what's sort of happening in the unit market. So I think it's a space to watch, and that the Property Council of Australia has also been backed by the UDIA, which is the Urban Development Institute of Australia. They've also been going on about the supply of units here in Brisbane now, and coming out with the same sort of concerns. So to wrap up, we always like to look at some predictions. So every time I do a presentation, I touch back on the predictions that I had from the prior presentation. So at the start of December, when I last did this, my predictions I've copied over. I said that this year, at the start of the year, I would expect growth to continue, but at around the same rate. So I said for the year in total, approximately 10%, which would sit around, you know, that just under that 1%. So I think that's been pretty accurate. I've said that the lack of supply issue will continue back in December. We're definitely seeing that again. And then the other 2 points were just sort of around, like, the market had slowed in December. And so both of those points weren't really something that were predictions, they were just more commentary. So the great question is, what do I expect to happen in the next few months? So in May, June, July for the next quarter. I have said that Brisbane growth will continue, but it'll keep hovering around that 1% per month. So we're not seeing any great reason for that to change. I think the lack of supply issue needs to be addressed, and that does come down to some of those council approvals and densities, and it's not something that can be changed quickly. So I think we're going to hear much more around that, and I think that we will see that if, you know, the interest rates continue to rise and problems sort of in the wider economy, maybe it will become more of, more sort of like the data, people will start drilling down and sort of seeing the supply issue needs to be addressed. Units in Brisbane may be the ones to watch over the next 2 years. I think that, I agree with that. Like, we've seen so much competition, and we're seeing that from first home buyers and investors. Brisbane's still a very high yield in that market. So we're seeing a lot of competition there from buyers, and with the lack of supply coming through in that market, I think that the prices will continue to go up quite a bit. I think this sort of mid-sized capital grouping and trend that I've sort of picked up, I think it's worth watching to see if that does continue, and I would expect that it will. And then the Domain article that came out around, will Brisbane hit $1 million for a housing median by the end of the year? I think that's going to be a very close call. I'll probably say I think it's going to go very close, but I don't think it will this year. I think, you know, at that rate, it'd have to go up 1% every month. And like I've sort of said above, I think it will hover. So it'll be a close call, but I will sort of say, look, it'll be extremely close, but I don't think we'll hit it by the end of this year, maybe early next year though. So there's my details. I'm on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and if you have any questions, feel free.